Hi guys, so we're here in Extreme Landings and we're going to be attempting a takeoff and a banking soon after that. Before we start that, we're going to go through the flight controls. Just give me a second to get about 30% of our fuel tanks filled and then we'll get underway. Okay, so I was just stopping the fuel there at 30% only because I didn't want to be too heavy to attempt this takeoff. 30% fuel is more than enough for this flight. Okay, so if we're in any of the menus and you press down on the spacebar, as you can see, these little numbers and letters just pop up over all of the buttons that we can interact with. Pretty much those show you what buttons you need to press on your keyboard in order to access those controls or menus. So if we press on the number 1 here, as you can see, a map appears. And this is pretty much allows us to see the terrain around us. We can see any waypoints around us. And we can also see airports around us. As you can see here, this is LaGuardia Airport and we are currently at JFK Airport. If you want to change your destination, all you have to do is click at another waypoint or click at another airport. Hit the spacebar so you can see what button you need to press. And as you can see down in the bottom left corner, pressing the button S will allow you to change your destination. So as you can see now here in orange, it tells us what heading we need to fly at in order to get to our new destination. So we're just going to set it back to our original flight path. Perfect. And as you can see in the bottom right corner, we have our autopilot. So first we have in this corner speed, so that allows us to control our speed. Heading over here, altitude and vertical speed. What vertical speed is pretty much the rate at which we're either ascending or descending. So that's our vertical rate. Up in the top left corner, as you can see, this shows us our time. So that's like time of the day. If we click on here, we can adjust the wind, we can adjust the weather, and clicking on this allows you to fast forward if you're doing like a really long flight. So we're not going to be worrying about any of that today. Hitting the number 2 button opens up this submenu here. As we can see now on our left, we have our master throttle controls. So pressing Q and A will allow you to control your throttle. Right now, nothing's happening obviously because none of our engines have started. So we're just going to bring that back to 0 and leave that the way it was. To the right of our throttle controls, we have here a display that shows us how much fuel we have in our tanks and the pressure at which it's at. So yeah, as you can see, we have about 30% of fuel in our tanks, in the left tank and the right tank. What this slider down here, ER, allows us to do is it allows us to transfer fuel from one tank into another. So say for some reason one tank has a lot lower fuel than the other, that could cause an imbalance in the flight, and obviously we don't want that, so we would just transfer some fuel over. There's a pump that transfers fuel over. If we press the button just like that, so we're just going to level it out again to what it was. I think it was about 30 in each tank. Perfect. Now, so that's the fuel pump, and as you can see here, we have W and T to the right of those. What that allows us to do is ditch fuel from the aircraft. So pretty much it just releases fuel from the aircraft. That's used if we need to perform an emergency landing and we have too much fuel on board, because obviously if we have too much fuel on board, our distance to pretty much come to a halt after landing, after making contact with the runway, will increase. So we obviously don't want that. So if we have to perform an emergency landing and we have way too much fuel on board, we can ditch the fuel using W and T. As you can see to the right of that, we have our APU, auxiliary power unit. So if for some reason we were to lose the engines during flight, we would obviously lose control over the hydraulics, which would allow us to control the direction of the aircraft. So if we immediately switch on the APU, all of a sudden now we have control again over at least the direction of the aircraft. Underneath the APU, we have the anti-ice. And so what that does, it pretty much heats up and expands these rubber elements that we have along the front of the plane. So if I just zoom in just up here where my mouse is, we have rubber elements which heat up and move around pretty much. And what that does is it allows us to break any ice that's forming around our wings, because if ice forms around the wings, we pretty much lose lift from that wing, which is not great at all. To the right of the anti-ice, we have oxygen, which we just leave on, and our automatic asset manager. To the right of that, we have our landing gear. So pretty much wheels up, wheels down, and we also have our brakes. So that's the master brake. And it also acts as the spoiler, which allows you to pretty much scrub off speed really, really fast. Now going into the next submenu, number 3, we can see we have some instruments, some new instruments here. We still have the throttle over here, and now this panel is new. So what we have in the middle here is called our artificial horizon, and what that allows us to do is we can pretty much see the angle at which our aircraft is currently flying. So we can see the angle of attack, we can see the angle of roll, and so that's a very useful feature, one of the most important instruments in our cockpit, because the pilots can't always see the ground, and therefore we can't always see the horizon as well if it's like cloudy. And so we always need to be able to tell at what angle our plane is flying. And so that's why the artificial horizon is so important. As you can see in the middle, we have 2 purple lines. I think you can just make those out. And what those are is our ILS, so Instrument Landing System. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to pretty much land very accurately. So what that does is it tells us if we need to go left, if we need to go right, to get in line with the runway. So we're perfectly in line with the runway right now. So obviously the ILS indicators are right in the middle there. To the left of the ILS here, we have our speed in knots, and as you can see, we're stationary right now, and therefore our speed in knots is 0. To the right, we have our altitude, and to the right of that, again, we have our vertical speed. So that tells us the rate at which we're going up or going down. Underneath that, we have our distance in nautical miles to our destination. And down here we have the direction as well in which we need to fly to get to our destination. So as you can see, as soon as we take off, we need to bank left in order to get in line to fly to our destination. To the right of that, again, we have navigation. This also serves as a weather map. So if you're flying through adverse weather, we'll be able to see like really red clouds or really yellow clouds, and what we need to do is pretty much avoid those areas, because those areas are areas of turbulence and it's very dangerous to fly through those areas. So we need to pretty much fly around such turbulent weather. To the right of that, we have our flaps. Again, if you press the space bar, we can see that pressing the minus key will lower our flaps, and pressing the period key will put our flaps back up. To the right of that, again, landing gear, brake or spoiler. Pressing number 4, we return to a full view of our aircraft, and we have the bare minimum controls available to us and our speed and altitude. Pressing number 5, this is our engine controls. So what we have to the left, again, if we press the space bar, we can see we can control how much power is going to each one of our 4 engines. And what this screen allows us to do, especially this corner, is we can give little adjustments to each of our engines. To say I want my number 2 engine to spin up just a little bit faster. As you can see, I can move just the number 2 engine up. We're going to put that back to 0 now. As you can see now, in the middle over here, we have our engine switches. So what this does is it sends electricity to the engines, which is the first step to starting up the engines. Now, I've already left our number 2 engine on, and that was just so that our refueling stops. But pretty much when we come to an aircraft, everything's going to be turned off. We need to turn on all of our engines. So Y, U, I, O, P. Sorry, not P, just Y, U, I, O for engines. And following that, we have our engine starters. So we have H, J, K, L. And what that does is it sends compressed air to our engines, allows the engines to spool up, and then we have power to the aircraft. We're going to come back to that. Above that, we have our fire controls. So up here, as you can see, it says fire, push, engine 1, 2, 3, 4. That means fire suppression for each of our engines. What we do is, so if we have a fire coming from one of our engines, we need to flip this panel up and then hit the fire button. And what that does is it'll suppress the fire. Sometimes you might have to hit it a couple times because you'll need a couple of the suppressants. I've personally never had to suppress a fire mid-flight. So we keep these closed, obviously, because once you suppress an engine, once you've used a fire suppressant, we lose power to that engine. That's obviously just a safety feature. We keep those closed if we're not operating the fire switches. Following that, we have number 6, and this is our takeoff landing panel. So again, to our left, we have our master throttle. To the right here, we have our landing gear. And what we have here is the manual releases to our landing gear. So what this aircraft has is 4 sets of landing gear. Sometimes what can happen, and this happens really, really rarely, is that when you lower your landing gear, one of the sets of landing gear does not get lowered. So in that case, you'll need to come here and manually release them using either the buttons E, S, D, or F. You have to use those really, really rarely, so really you don't need to worry about them. After that, down here, we have our rudder, which we control using V and N. As you can see here, if I can just get it like that, V and N. That controls our rudder, which is just up here on the back of the vertical stabilizer. Again, we've been through these controls, and we have our flaps here, brakes here. So that's our controls. Those are our major flight controls, and we are now going to attempt a takeoff. If you can just give me a second. Okay, now, one more thing actually before we take off is that to control the direction of the aircraft, you have to use the arrow keys. And so by pressing the down arrow key,